Don't know when the last light bulb moment happened for you, when you became aware of something significant, usually regarding something that you had looked at or read or considered for many years. Suddenly you understood its significance and it really affected your life. For some people, it has been identifying what that icon is on their fuel gauge on the car. That icon of a petrol pump either on the right or on the left of their fuel gauge. Many drivers have driven around looking at their fuel gauge, unaware of the significance of that particular icon on the fuel gauge. But then one day, they are told, or they work out for themselves, that the significance of this petrol pump icon on their fuel gauge is indicating where the cap for their fuel is on their car, either on the right-hand side or the left-hand side of their car. For years, they have driven into the petrol pumps, wondering what side is that cap on in the back of my car. Often they have got it wrong. They've got out and tried to stretch the hose round to the back of their car to fill their car. Sometimes they have even got to get into their car again and drive round the other side. But what a moment it was for them when they realized that right in front of their eyes all of the time was this indicator where the cap on their car actually was. And this is the idea here in this chapter. People are seeing things that are significant. Their eyes are being opened in a moment of trial and of difficulty to see answers, to see people they've never seen for many years, to see circumstances in which they think God is working, but how is he working in our lives? And so the writer here draws our attention to this special form of the Hebrew verb see and uses it 4 times, as I've indicated in our chapter, to draw attention to these significant moments in the lives of God's people in the Old Testament. Joseph is now 37, at least 37 years of age. He's 30 when he became prime minister. 7 years of the famine or the plenty has already happened. They're into the years of famine now. And here in this chapter, he's prime minister of Egypt. Verse 57 of chapter 41 ended that all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain. How God had turned his circumstances around and put him in a position of significance, not just for the earth, not just for the land and nation and empire of Egypt, but also for the Old Testament church. So let's notice this evening these 3 significant uses, or there's 4, but we're grouping the last 2 together. These significant uses, and this is the writer's intention, it's got to be, isn't it? This is the point he wants us to walk out the door with this evening. These significant sights in this particular chapter. It is a chapter that stands by itself, and we'll come to this at the very end of our sermon. The word harm is used in verse 4 and then used in the very last verse of the chapter. It's only used 5 times in the Old Testament, and so this chapter is an inclusio, a grammatical tool that the writer has used. The story stands on its own. And in it, there are these 3 significant sightings. The first one then is a seeing of redemption, or a seeing of relief in verses 1 to 5. Jacob saw that there was grain for sale in Egypt. We understand the ESV translation, Jacob learned, because what he saw taught him what was going on. He saw something and he learned from what he saw. And what he learned was that there was grain for sale in Egypt. There was Jacob standing at his tent door in Hebron, and he could see onto this highway of crowds and caravanners of people heading down south. And he began to wonder why all these peoples from the north of Palestine and beyond were journeying down towards Egypt. He saw this, and he learned from what he saw that there was grain for sale in Egypt. It seems that he'd gone out onto this highway, and he had confronted some of those travelers who were coming back up the road from having gone down south, which he found out was in Egypt. And so he says in verse 2, and advance on verse 1, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. In verse 1, he saw that there was grain for sale. In verse 2, he says, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. He's gone down to the road. He's encountered these people with donkeys saddled with grain, heading back beyond Hebron and up into the northern countries. And he's asked them what's going on, where they got this grain. He has heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. And so, like Abraham, who suffered a famine, and like Isaac, his father, who suffered a famine in the land of Canaan in chapter 26, Jacob now, in the land of Canaan, is suffering a famine. And each time, the solution was in Egypt. There was always food in Egypt. Jacob sees that there was food for sale in Egypt. How significant that seeing was. It will turn out that this seeing of Jacob will result in his descendants living for 400 years in that land of Egypt. If he never saw that there was grain for sale in Egypt, they would never have ended up going down to Egypt. What a significant seeing this is. He's the only one who sees it. Out of all his family, it's only Jacob who sees that there is grain for sale in Egypt. But in contrast to this wise seeing is the foolish seeing of his sons. Their seeing is mentioned at the end of verse 1. Why do you look at one another? Jacob here was looking outside his tent, outside his camp. Yes, they were beginning to starve. Yes, they were running short of food. He's looking outside there for a solution. In the meanwhile, his sons are looking at one another. They're looking inwardly. They're looking at themselves. At the very minimum, this phrase means that they are indolent, that they are hopeless, that they are lazy. They've thrown in the towel. They've given up. Yes, they've got a problem, but they're looking at one another. Hamilton, in his commentary, he suggests perhaps a higher level of understanding this phrase, that they were deliberately playing ignorance, that they were looking at one another instead of looking at Jacob or interacting with him, and that they were keeping this closed shop, this tight band. They knew that there was corn in Egypt. It would be hard to avoid the rumors and the chatter at the street corner. But their history had haunted them, and that was the last place that they ever wanted to go. But perhaps the best understanding of this phrase is to see that it's a reference to conflict among the brothers. Because this phrase, to look at one another, is usually used in the Old Testament of animosity, of confrontation, of battle. So, for example, 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 8 and verse 11, this phrase is used. Then Amaziah, Amaziah sent messengers to Jehoash, king of Israel, "Come, let us look one another in the face." So here it seems are the brothers fighting among themselves, blaming one another, falling out within the camp. But there's Jacob. He's seeing the solution, giving the answer, providing the relief. We can all look at the same thing in different ways, can't we? Denmark can look at Greenland and say, well, that's mine. The USA can look at Denmark and say, well, that should be mine. China can look at we're on Greenland here. China can look at Greenland and say, well, we want it to be mine. It's mine. It should be mine. I want it to be mine. And here are these men, this family. They've got this problem of dwindling food. The brothers are insular. But Jacob is visionary. And perhaps there's a challenge for the elders and deacons as we come to meet tomorrow evening. And on our agendas, as there always is on every agenda of deacons and of elders, there are challenges. Are we going to come blaming one another, pointing fingers at one another? One member said to me a long time ago, "You got us into this mess, you need to get us out of this mess." That's not what Jacob does here, is it? He's visionary. He sees the solution. And how good it would be for us to come tomorrow night and to all our session and deacons' meetings, not with criticism, but with answers, with solutions, with suggestions that are wise and manageable for a way forward. So what a seeing this is. A seeing of relief. Secondly, there's a seeing of reconciliation in verse 6 to 25. What tremendous words they are in verse 7, aren't they? Joseph saw his brothers. There were thousands of people coming from all over the world, maybe millions, to get relief from food. But in God's amazing providence, Joseph saw his brothers. And there's lots been written on this and what happens in the following verses. But I interpret this, that from this moment on, the only thing in Joseph's heart was love. He had said in chapter 41 and verse 51, God has made me forget all my hardship. He's moved on. He's got no grudge, no gripe, no axe to grind, no revenge to take. God has made me forget all my hardship. That love is expressed in verse 24 that we read. He wept over them. Verse 25, he returned their money. All of this points to Joseph only loving his brothers. There's a whole range of other interpretations of what Joseph does here, which I've set aside. Some think that he goes out to punish them, that he goes out to set things in place that will remind them of what they did to him, that he might bring them to repentance. I don't think he's got any of that in his mind at all. All those connections to chapter 37 are purely incidental. So we read in verse number 9, he calls them spies because he was a spy for his father Jacob. In verse 9, he talks about the nakedness of the land, an unusual phrase. in echo, some argue, of them stripping him of his clothes. In verse number 3, he puts them in prison. It's the same word used in chapter 37 for 3 days to give them a taste of their own medicine. They had put him into the prison. In verse 35, the money is in their sacks, their bags. The same word used of the silver that was used in his sale. In verse 19, he holds one brother and sends the rest home as a reflection of him being abandoned by his brothers and the rest returning home. So from those 5 incidences, many commentators argue that here is Joseph engineering circumstances to humble his brothers, to get a bit of revenge on them, to remind them of what they did to him. I think they're wrong. I think the only thing in Joseph's heart was love for his brothers. And all he does here, in not revealing his identity immediately, is to learn more information. All he does in keeping Simeon in the prison is so that they will return to Egypt with his brother Benjamin and ultimately with his father. His heart is full of compassion and forgiveness and grace. Joseph saw his brothers. But again, there's a contrast to this gracious, loving, caring, forgiving seeing that Joseph has here. And the contrast is an incredible one with how his brothers had once looked on him. In verse 21, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. So the brothers here have been put in the prison for 3 days in Egypt by Joseph. He's giving them time to think of his plan A. And his plan A was that one of the brothers would return to Jacob to bring Benjamin down to Egypt. But after those 3 days of incarceration, Joseph changes his mind about that plan, and he goes to plan B. That not one brother would go back to Jacob, but that 9 brothers would go back to Jacob, and one would remain in the prison. Now, he changed that plan probably because 9 needed to carry enough grain to feed the family, he thought. 9 would be more persuasive with Jacob than 1, he reasoned. And it would be too much for his aging father, Jacob, to lose 9 of his sons. So he reflects on his plan A while his brothers are in the prison and changes it to plan B. But his brothers in the prison are also reflective. And when they're let out after 3 days, they revisit this sight, this seeing, this moment when they looked on Joseph. There's no mention of it in chapter 37, but here it is here. Their conscience bringing to their fore and to their very mouths an expression of their heartlessness and their hatred. We saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. What a contrast of seeing this is, isn't it? Here is Joseph, Prime Minister, exalted, powerful, and he's looking at the brothers that hurt him so deeply, and he looks on them in love. But here are the brothers remembering that they looked on Joseph with absolute hatred. What a vision. What a sight. This tremendous contrast between Joseph and how he treats his brothers and how they have treated him is emphasized and enlarged by the use in verse 21 to 23 of the same Hebrew word for listen. In verse 21, the brothers would not listen to Joseph. In verse 22, the brothers would not listen to Reuben. But in verse 23, Joseph is listening to them. They won't listen, but Joseph listens to them. We can look at brothers and sisters in the congregation in different ways. Joseph could have looked at his brother in a different way. He looked on them in grace and forgiveness and restraint and mercy. We can look at our brothers and sisters and we can remember the wrongs that they have done. We can remember the wrongs they have done to us. And every time we see them, that's all that comes to our mind. Or we can look at our brothers and sisters as they are in Jesus Christ, loved by God the Father, died for by his Son, Jesus Christ, and dwelt by the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, in his life and experience, he lets us into how he can look on his brothers in this compassionate and merciful way as he names his sons in the previous chapter. Verse 51 and 52, God has made me forget, and God has made me fruitful in my affliction. Seeing of reconciliation. And lastly, the seeing of retribution. We come to the last two uses of this form of the verb seeing in verse 27 and in verse 35. He saw his money, verse 27. They and their father saw their bundles of money in verse 35. The easiest interpretation of these two statements is probably something like this. As they journeyed back from Egypt to the land of Canaan, they stopped at a lodging place and they got their bundles of grain down to feed their donkeys. One of the brothers, his money was sitting on the top. He opened the sack and there, his money was there. Just one brother is mentioned in verse 27. And he tells the others, and they're all afraid. But then when they arrive home and they dump out the whole of the sack into the granary, they discover that every sack contains all of the money that they had paid Joseph for the grain. And as they saw this, there is a right seeing and there is a wrong seeing. As they saw the money, Jacob for the first time understands what has happened to Joseph. He sees the money and one of his sons are absent. This has happened before. He joins up the dots. He doesn't get it fully right, but he's close now. He's got this inkling that his sons go away. They come back minus one, but their pockets filled with cash. What's going on here? And so he says in verse number 36, you have bereaved me of my children. This is the first time he blames his sons for the loss of now his two sons. He doesn't fully understand what's going on here, but he's got some inkling that this is not what he thought had happened to Joseph. But then there's a very wrong seeing by the brothers and by Jacob. As they saw this money, the brothers misinterpret this. In verse number 28 and 35, they are afraid. They are afraid that when they return back down to Canaan, Joseph is going to accuse them of being thieves. They will need grain in the future. Egypt is the only place to get grain. They're afraid that they will be arrested, imprisoned, punished. Egypt was already suspicious of people from Canaan. They had built a large canal along its eastern boundary. They had set up cities along the eastern border of Canaan. Already, Joseph has accused them of being spies. Here was a group of 10 men together in a foreign land. What else could they be but spies? And now they're afraid. They're afraid that this money will bring them into great danger. But how wrong they were. This money was a token of love from Joseph for his family. Rather than it being a punishment for them, rather than it being a sign to try and link it to the silver that they had received for him when they betrayed him, he's doing nothing like that. He's purely granting them funds to live, to survive, to care for their family. They think wrongly about God as well in verse 25. They ask this question, what is God? Or verse number 28, what is this that God has done to us? They are thinking that this money is bringing them back to the betrayal of their brother, that in God's providence, the silver in chapter 37 and the silver in chapter 42 is somehow linked, that this is reminding them and haunting them of the wrong that they have done. But it's nothing of the sort. This is a kind providence of God, providing for them in their hour of need. Jacob also is wrong in his interpretation of the money, isn't he? He says in verse 36, all this has come against me. Joseph is not around anymore. Simeon is not around anymore. They want Benjamin to go down into Egypt as well. All this is against me. But all of this was actually working for him. Joseph, being away, is now prime minister and will be the provider and carer for all the Old Testament church. How wrong the brothers were. How wrong Jacob was in interpreting this money which they saw. Matthew Henry writes, guilty consciences are apt to take good providences in a bad sense. Money here is not retribution, but provision for their need. So let us just enjoy God's goodness. Let us thank him for his kind providences, that good things can actually come to God's people in this life. That we can receive sudden windfalls of cash out of God's blessing. I've got a Christian friend who has a comfortable living, who lives in fear that one day God will take it all from her. And this paragraph is saying to us, just enjoy it. The money in the sack, it's not retribution. It's not a trick or a snare to get you into trouble. Out of Joseph's heart, out of God's heart, it is unadulterated goodness, kindness, generosity, and love. Psalm 103 verse 2 says, do not forget all his benefits to us. I read a Jewish saying which says that we will be judged for not enjoying the good gifts of God in this life. I don't think the saying's true, but I think it's got a point. Enjoy your family. Enjoy the comforts that God has given to you in his providence and in his grace, if they are yours. So, what a chapter this is. important seeings, the seeing of redemption or relief, the seeing of reconciliation, the seeing of retribution. But this chapter, wonderful, amazing, gripping that it is, wants us to see something even greater. It wants us to leave church seeing the amazing love of God in giving his only Son for sinners. And right at the very end of the chapter, unusual wording is used to bring out this point. See in verse 38, Jacob saying, my son. He's addressing his sons. He doesn't say your brothers, but in God's guidance he says, my son. And then in the next line, the only one. My son, the only one. And it links into chapter 22 of Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac. At the very start of that chapter, the same words are used. Take your son, your only son, and offer him as a sacrifice. And in that chapter of Abraham, it was heartbreaking for Abraham to take his son, his only son, and offer him. And here in this chapter, it's hard for Jacob to take his son, his only son, and give him away. And we mentioned the inclusio in verse 4, and in the last verse, he was concerned if harm should happen to him. This was his reluctance. He didn't want to part with his son. He was afraid that harm would come to him. Verse 15 uses the unusual word tested, used in Genesis 22, verse 1 of Abraham. He was tested to give his only son. And here's Jacob, and he's being tested to part with his only son. And these two chapters, 22 and 42, they're giving us insight into the heart of God. Can he give his only son? This is how hard it is. So hard for Abraham, so hard for Jacob to give his only son, to give him to be harmed. But Abraham did. And Jacob did. And God did. Gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life.